Hello folks, we're here in South Carolina in the middle of hurricane season, and with the afternoon storms coming through or hurricane coming through, one thing you will see very frequently is what you have beside me, storm-thrown trees. Before you do any cutting with chainsaws on any types of wood, it is very important for you to wear your safety gear, including your chainsaw chaps, cut-resistant leg protection. If you should accidentally cut into your legs, you're protected, the saw will stop. You also should wear a helmet system for anything that could fall from the top, hearing protection such as earmuff, and eye protection such as a face shield or safety glasses. Another safety precaution that I would like you all to take away from this video is that as you're working with chainsaws, the moment you're done making a cut, engage your chain brake. Flick your wrist forward, you hear the click, your chain no longer runs. If you walk, you trip, you fall, you squeeze the trigger, that chain is no longer gonna run and cannot hurt you. Alright, so what are some of the considerations before you start cutting a storm-thrown tree like this one here? So first, you want to look at what you have. Do you work with hardwoods that have really branchy tops, or do you work with pine trees that are basically a straight stem and then some little branches coming off? Right here, what we see is we have an oak tree sitting on top of a pine tree. So another thing you have to think about is what happens if you have multiple trees piled on top of each other. So what that means is that you have branches that are intertangled, intertwisted with each other. But before you start cutting anything like this, you need to assess which tree is on top of which and where do you need to start cutting first. You don't want to start cutting main stems and large branches on the tree that's laying underneath another tree. Start at the very top and work your way downwards as well. So you start at the ground, work backwards, and you start from the top tree down to the bottom tree. Another issue that comes up when you have trees that are on top of each other, you start creating what's called spring poles. You have branches that are bent under tension, that if you cut them, they will suddenly release all the pressure, all the tension that they have, and they can hit you in the shin, they can hit you in the face, they can break your nose, all kinds of things. So you want to make sure you work very carefully to assess those spring poles. Another consideration that you have to think about is the root ball. These storm-thrown trees are still attached to the root ball, and trees attached to the root ball, while they're laying on the ground, as you are cutting away material from the tree, the root ball and stem attached to it can move up and stand up again. And it's not uncommon for pieces 10 feet or 20 feet long to just suddenly move up once you remove enough weight from the top part. Another thing you want to consider is the tension and the compressions that's in every single piece of wood that you have sitting here. Every branch, every bowl, every cut you make, you want to assess the compression and the tension in the wood. The last thing you want to happen is you're cutting a branch off and then the branch or the bowl, the whole log, basically starts swinging out and hitting you because you're releasing tension that you didn't think about. Another thing you want to consider before you start cutting with your chainsaw is, are there any overhead hazards? So you want to look up and you want to look around and see, are there any dead branches sitting in trees that are surrounding the area that you're cutting? So just make sure you look around, and if there are any overhead hazards present, make sure to address them first before you start working on your storm-damaged wood that's on the ground. Alright, so we talked a little bit about the hazards and the considerations about working with storm-thrown trees. Now the question is, how would you approach cutting this tree up? Now here's my approach. Whenever you have storm-thrown wood, the first thing you want to do is obviously take away anything that's still green so you get to really see. So cut off like some of the little branches, the little twigs, so you get to see what you're working with. Do not cut the main stem in the middle of the trunk. You do not want to do that. The way you want to approach cutting a tree is, once you see what you're doing, start working from the crown all the way back to the root ball. Now with every cut that you make, you want to make sure that you assess the cut before you make it. You also want to make sure that before you do any cut, you have an escape route planned. As you make the cut and stuff starts moving in unexpected ways, you have a clear path to walk away from the tree and then just let the tensions come out without hurting you. So now the question is, how do you tackle this? All the load-bearing, the non-load-bearing stuff is gone. Now everything else that you have here bears load, which means the moment you make a cut, something will happen. Now you're going to release some tension, some compression, and the logs will start to move. So again, the question is, what's the approach to cutting this down? The first part we're going to do is we're going to assess, is that oak leaning into one particular direction or another? If I look at the stump up there where it's still connected, there's a big root ball on this side of the log, so I don't think the oak is going to roll over this way. If I look up here, I see that I have a big wide long stem here that will support the log. So my feeling right now is that if I'm going to take off part of this log, the main stem will not rotate. I can take this down and then slowly work my way from the top again back to the root ball before I cut off the stump. The main goal here is to get the main stem down onto the ground. All right, now we're ready to make our first cut to take that big oak log down onto the ground. So as I talked before, we have this branch here that's sticking out to the side. So to make a cut right here, we have to consider the compression and the tension that's present in the wood here. Compression is where fibers are pushed together. Tension is where fibers want to basically pull apart. And the compression and tension in a log changes depending on where you make your cut. So you always have to assess it at the point where you're going to make your cut. If I want to cut right here, what I have is compression wood on the top because my stem comes down here, it's supported on one end and it's supported on the other end, but once I cut it, it wants to basically fold away towards the ground, which means it compresses on the top. That also means on the bottom, I have now tension wood. Tension means, again, it wants to pull apart, the fibers want to pull apart and open the cut. What happens with compression wood, as you make a cut into the compression wood, the wood wants to close and eventually pinch your chainsaw. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna use a notch on the top in the compression side. So we're gonna create a notch opening here, about a quarter or so in, and then we're gonna come in from the bottom and finish our cut, taking that saw all the way from the bottom, moving it up. As we're cutting, this log should basically take that V and fold it together while it's opening up on the bottom, and then this log will just go straight onto the ground. At the very end, when there was just one main stem hanging over the road, we went up to the root ball and we cut off the main stem from the root ball and then finished cutting the rest of the main stem that was now leaning or laying on the road into shorter pieces and moved it out of the way. So at this point, there's a lot of short pieces laying around here. We're gonna clean this up with a tractor or by hand later on. That's easy. The one thing that's remaining here is that pine tree that's at the very bottom. We did not cut anything off the pine tree other than maybe some non-weight bearing branches. So what you would have to do next is to go out, cut off the top of the pine tree, and then basically do the same thing. Work your way back from the top to the root ball, and then cut that main stem of that pine tree off the root ball, get it onto the ground, and then you can cut it into short pieces, get it out of the road. Now all of this is exhausting. So if you ever feel fatigued, weak, tired, you have to stop working with chainsaws. It is dangerous to work with a chainsaw when you're not fully there, when you're just feeling like, fatigued or something like that. At that point, take a break or let somebody else work with the chainsaw. Chainsaws are heavy. Working through oak trees and hardwoods in general is pretty labor intensive. So just make sure you take care of yourself, and whatever you do, every cut you make sure you have an escape route and make sure you watch the movement of the log. As soon as you see movement in a log, just stop cutting and move away. Step away a couple steps, see what the log is doing, and then come back when the log has stopped moving. You have to go slow. You can't rush into cleaning up storm damaged wood. All right, we're now at a different location and we're gonna talk about what to do with hung up trees. Like a tree that's either uprooted or partially broken off, and then instead of falling all the way to the ground, it is hung up in some other trees. Right now here I have a nice little pine that the storm knocked over. It didn't uproot the tree, it just broke it basically at the base, and the fiber started breaking and it started falling over, and it is now hung up in a bunch of smaller trees that are now just bent over. Another thing, before you start cutting with your chainsaw, a couple things you need to think about. One, never walk underneath a hung up or leaning tree. While this tree may look like it's solid and it's not moving, all it could take is like a little bit of wind or a little bit of movement and this thing comes down. So never walk underneath a hung up tree. The second thing is, never try to cut the little trees that the tree is hung up in. If you try to cut them out, one, the spring pole is gonna expand, it's gonna pop out, it's gonna release all its tension, and that could hurt you and injure you, right? Two, whenever you cut one of the little trees, that could be enough movement that the big tree that's hung up is actually gonna come down at that moment. So you have absolutely no control, plus you have to work under the hung up tree, so don't do that. And now the question is, how do you work a tree like that? The first thing you want to do, right, when you assess any hung up tree, you look into like, where's that tree hung up? And just looking at this one, like I just said, the crown is just sitting on top of a bunch of smaller trees that are bent over. The tree is not uprooted, it's still connected at the base. If a tree is caught between a fork, you can't really do much, it's just sitting there, so you may need a bucket truck or something. But if a tree like this one here is just sitting on top of other crowns, you want to see if it's possible for that tree that's hung up to maybe slide either to one side or the other side and then get enough movement going to get down to the ground. But for now, we're just gonna try to cut it off the stump. We're using the same technique that we just used with storm damaged wood. We're gonna cut a V-shape opening on the compression side and then finish the cut on the tension side to get this whole log sitting on the ground. And then we use our PV log turner tool and basically try to roll it off. We're gonna try that. If that doesn't work, there's a bunch of other techniques that you can use to basically start bucking up the log here in short sections and get it like steeper and steeper, and then maybe use some chain or rope to pull the tree off of the ground. So at this point, we have taken the hung up tree down as much as we could. It turned out that the crown is way more entangled in the other trees than we expected, which means at this point you see part of the main stem hanging in the air with some rope attached to it. At this point, there's nothing we can do manually anymore to pull it down, so we would have to bring in a tractor or track hoe or something like that and pull it down with the help of some mechanical equipment. But to recap what we have done here, at the very beginning, I made a cut with a V opening and tried to get the log, the entire tree basically down from the stump onto the ground. We then tried to roll it with a PV or log turner. That didn't work very well, so I basically went down and I did the same cut again that we cut with a controlled release cut from underneath to slowly release the energy of the tree, let it fall down and break down. And then we tried to roll it again. We did this about 2 or 3 times and it just didn't work. Like, we couldn't roll it manually with a log turner. So at that point, as that tree is getting shorter and shorter, the angle of that tree leaning into the other trees is going to get steeper and steeper. So at a point where it looked like this, about maybe a 30-degree upwards angle, we decided to use a different cutting technique that resembles a directional felling cut. So we made an open notch, we did a bore cut, and then we did a release cut in the trigger wood on the back. And then before we did that, we had a rope attached to the lower part of the trunk that we were cutting off, and then trying to manually pull basically that short 3-foot, 4-foot section off backwards to force the tree to slide back, but also to get shorter at the same time. We tried it with 2 people, that didn't work very well, so we attached a come along and then basically hooked our rope to the come along and pulled it back, and we've done that a couple times. At this point, we have done as much as we could because the last piece came off, but the crown is still hung up in the other tree, so there's no way we're going to get this down manually. So again, at this point, we need to bring in some heavy equipment. If you ever leave something like this, a leaning tree hanging in some other trees, it's not ideal. You shouldn't leave it there in the first place, but if you have to, make sure you flag the area with some tape to make sure that other people are aware that there's a hazard and that nobody walks underneath that crown, and then come back as soon as you can to pull this down. But what we have achieved here is, if this leaning tree was across a road, we managed to open up the road and get emergency vehicles through the area by just doing what we have done. So taking down the crown is just like another bonus that you have to do for final cleanup, but just to get emergency access, this would have been more than enough to get a vehicle in and out of here.